Okay, thank you, Chris. And thanks everybody for joining us today. As Chris said, my name is Ryan Pankau. I'm a horticulture educator for University of Illinois Extension. And I have past experience as both an arborist, so doing tree care. That was kind of my first job out of college. And as a forester. Right before coming to Extension, I spent a number of years as a forester for NRCS in Southern Illinois. So today I want to talk about forest invaders, so all the invasive plants that are threatening our forests in Illinois. So to frame this conversation, I'd like to start today by just kind of talking about Illinois forests in general, to look at some of the management challenges and just kind of discuss that, and so we can talk about how these invasives kind of fit into that whole challenge. Spend a few slides talking about why do invasives matter? Why should we as gardeners, as homeowners, as landowners, why should we care about this? Why should we worry about these plants on our property? And then we'll end with some slides that are specific to invasive species. So that's going to be the meat of the presentation here, where I want to focus on some identification today, because I get that question a lot of, is this an invasive species, or what plant is this? We'll talk about how these plants spread, because that's important to stop their spread, to understand how they're spreading, what's the mechanism. And then finally, I'll give you guys some information about some of the best control methods, or some of my experience on what's worked, what hasn't worked. And then we'll end the presentation with some references that will really have some details. So I'm probably going to talk about control in pretty general terms on a lot of these slides, but if you guys really want exact herbicide recommendations and those kind of things, some of the references at the end of my presentation will be where you would go for that.
Hey, Ryan, before you get going, we're seeing your presenter view and not your actual PowerPoint. So if you can switch that, that way it would show up bigger on the screen.
Sure. Let's see. Okay, so you guys should be seeing just like my PowerPoint open right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think, are you still seeing the presenter view?
Yes. When you share your screen, choose like you can go to share screen or try that one and see if it'll work.
I think that should have done it.
Yes. Great.
You guys see it? Okay. Well, sorry about that, folks. That's the product of having two computer monitors right here. So I couldn't tell. I didn't know you guys were seeing the side screen. So, okay. Back to our conversation on Illinois forests. So earlier this week, Aaron kind of talked about how Illinois prairies have changed over time. Well, Illinois forests have seen some change as well. So pre-settlement, our state was about 40% forest cover, where currently it's about 12%. So we've lost a lot of our forested land cover over the years, over the last couple hundred years. Interestingly, though, 70% of our native biota occurs in these forested settings. 82% of our forests are in private ownership, and that average parcel size amongst those forests is about 21 acres. So what that tells me is that a lot of folks that are listening today may be forested landowners. There's a lot of private landowners that really are in charge of the stewardship of these forests. So it is important for all of us as members of the public or landowners to kind of understand invasives and forest management, because we actually have 82% of the forests in our possession. So, and the last stat there is that 97% of Illinois forests are classified as hardwoods. So we have a tiny amount of coniferous forests, a tiny bit of which are native, but most have been planted. So when we look at disturbance history in Illinois, disturbance is just how we've changed forests, how they've been manipulated over the years. It's safe to say that most acres of forested land in Illinois have been cleared at one time or another for farming. The picture at the bottom right, it symbolizes what some areas of southern Illinois might have looked like at around the turn of the century. A lot of those forests were cleared for lumber that we use to build things, and all the different things that we need trees for, those forests were cleared. Grazing was a part of a lot of forests, and to this day, a lot of stands of trees that you walk around in, you can see signs of past grazing. There's also a long history of just a general lack of management, and high grading is one of those things we've done where we've taken out the biggest and best trees each time we've harvested, and that has succeeded in lowering the gene pool, so to speak, where if you take out all the really good trees, then the seed that's coming off of what's left is not as good at genetics. Also, a lot of unmanaged cutting. There's a lot of times that trees have been taken out of a forest without a forester involved, without a plan, and So that results in some unwanted results in the end. Fire suppression is also a big part of that. And, you know, that's since the 1920s, we've really had heavy fire suppression. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on another slide up here where we kind of talk about management of these forests. But if we look at where we sit then in a bigger picture, we're part of the central hardwoods forest. So you can see that the map of it, it stretches from, you know, Illinois all the way out to the Smoky Mountains there. And there's a number of different forest types or forest type groups, or forest types is what I usually refer to them as. And oak hickory is the biggest percentage of that across, you know, the central hardwoods forest. So that oak hickory forest, again, primary type in the central hardwood forest, but covers a big chunk of it. And we know that this plant community has one of the highest diversities. So if we manage for a healthy oak hickory ecosystem, we get one of the greatest amounts of plant and animal diversity that we can put on a chunk of land. And that's a good thing. We also know that along, you know, just along the same theme of having high diversity, it has oak hickory forests have a high wildlife value, and we know they have a high timber value. We really like oak trees for a lot of different forest products that we would actually use from our woods. So oak hickory forests have some kind of unique requirements, or some interesting aspects with respect to plant succession. So on a dry site or a xeric site, that's what a forester might call it, oak hickory is the climax forest type. So that means, you know, there's a little diagram in the bottom right there that shows us, you know, a depiction of plant succession. So that is the change in plant species that happens over time. So in that picture, you can see we're going from annual plants all the way to a mature forest, and that end result over time, as those plants compete and the species composition changes, are our climax species. So on a dry site, that would be oak and hickory. On a higher quality site or a mesic site, or a site that has more moisture, more fertility, oak hickory is not the climax forest type. So on those type of sites, if we want an oak hickory forest, there's more management required to keep them there. You know, an example of this is really illustrated well with the Missouri Ozarks. If anybody's ever visited there, you know, in the Ozarks, oaks are the climax forest type. And there's a lot of dry xeric sites there. So that's what's made oaks so competitive on those sites, that if you drive down the highway, you can see little oak seedlings in the ditches that are, you know, just growing there because they're competitive enough they can pop up in a mowed ditch. And that always amazes me when I drive around the Ozarks. But here in Illinois, we don't have as many of those dry xeric sites. We have a lot more of these mesic sites. So for us, we have to manage to keep oak and hickory competitive with some of these other plants. So again, this oak hickory system is highly dependent on disturbance, and especially on those mesic sites. But you know, natural disturbances and anthropogenic disturbances, so disturbances caused by humans, have driven this species composition over time. So for about the last 9,000 years, we've had pretty frequent fires. You know, in recent history, as we've settled Illinois, as we've broken the landscape into these 21-acre parcels all over the place, we've separated, we've taken what used to be large contiguous forest across southern Illinois. As you get further north in the state, we would have just had forests kind of along the streams and drainage ways, and you know, where prairie dominated. In southern Illinois, we would have had a large contiguous forest that could have actually burned on, you know, a near annual basis if conditions were right. Where nowadays we have these not only segmented forests that are about 21 acres in size, but we've also become very, very good at fire suppression. So we don't let natural wildfires occur. And we now know that fire is a huge part of this ecosystem, and really was one of the driving forces behind oak and hickory's dominance in these places. So one of the aspects of managing for oaks is that they are pretty shade intolerant. They need about 40 to 60% light in the understory to be competitive with other plants that would grow there. So if those little oak trees want to grow to be the mature canopy tree, they need quite a bit of light to compete with some of the other plants that maybe have a little more shade tolerance or maybe have a faster growth rate. So the absence of fire, or our removal of fire from the landscape, has promoted a lot of these shade-loving species, a lot of these faster-growing plants that can outcompete our oaks, especially in a totally shaded environment. So one of the biggest management struggles in managing forests in Illinois is getting oak regeneration in the understory, or those little tiny oak trees that you see on the forest floor. And so as a forester, most of the time when I was walking around in someone's woodland, I was spending just as much time looking at my feet, at the ground, at the plants in the understory as I was the overstory, because if we don't have a healthy understory, we really can't disturb the overstory, because we'll get a plant response that we don't want. And so again, regeneration is the key to keeping an oak hickory forested system healthy, but management of that understory is pretty critical. And where our conversation comes in today is with invasive species, and control of these invasives is just a critical aspect of any type of management activity we do in a forested setting, especially cutting. So the picture at the right, that's an example of some timber stand improvement that was done, where you can see some kind of leaning trees that were cut over, some smaller understory trees that were cut and are on their side. And the whole point of this practice was to get more light to all that green shrubbery looking stuff you see in the understory there. That is a lot of tiny little oak trees that are just ready to shoot up into those spots. So without us removing some of those shade tolerant species, we wouldn't give those little oak seedlings a chance to grow up into the overstory. And if invasive species are there, we certainly don't want to increase light either through harvesting of the overstory or manipulation of the understory before we get those invasives under control, because that additional light is going to make them just that much more competitive with our native oaks. And so one thing I've found over my career in dealing with this is that edge habitat is pretty critical in all of this. And so here you see the edge habitat of where a forest meets a pasture. And so what happens there is we have a pretty dynamic situation. We have changing levels of light, usually a lot of light in that edge, and that's often the place where a lot of invasive species start to gain a foothold and start to invade the rest of our forest from there. So I found that although no matter how much control you do in the interior of the stand, if you don't control those invasives on the edge, you still have a massive infection source. And so that's pretty critical. In this particular picture, you can see some green all along the edge. This was taken in late November, and all of that green foliage, except to the left, there's maybe some pine trees. All of that green foliage in there are invasive species that are pretty thick in the forested edge, where if you'd walked into the interior of this stand, which it actually goes downhill out of the picture to the back, so it's kind of hard to see the treetops back there, you would have found a pretty good stand of trees and very few invasives inside there. So at whatever point any type of storm or disturbance or anything opens up the canopy behind this, all those invasives kind of in this edge are ready to plunge right in there. So that's another just kind of critical aspect of managing our forests in Illinois. So throughout the week, we've kind of talked about some of these definitions of invasive species. If you guys have joined us earlier in the week, you heard some really great ones, but I think one thing that kind of gets mixed up amongst a lot of folks are some of these terms. So if you see these three terms of adapted plants, naturalized plants, and invasive species, those are all non-native plants, whereas invasives are the ones that are a serious threat to our ecosystems, that outcompete our native plants, and that really threaten native plant diversity. Whereas naturalized plants, yeah, they can grow in a place outside of their native range, they can maybe reproduce, but they aren't causing damage, you know? Whereas finally, an adapted plant like the ginkgo you see in the upper picture is able to live here, but is not able to really reproduce, and certainly is not invasive. So just wanted to kind of clarify a few of those terms. I know folks have a lot of questions about. So from an ecological standpoint, why do these invasive species matter to us? Why do we care about these plants? Well, we know that they're one of the biggest threats to native plant diversity in the understory. So that ginseng in the upper right-hand corner there is really threatened by the bush honeysuckle in the bottom corner that would shade it out and outcompete it for the same location in the forest. Another interesting aspect is that half the species listed under the Endangered Species Act are threatened by invasive species. So they're a huge factor in all this. They're only second to habitat destruction as far as what is really threatening our native plant diversity the most in Illinois. So we've kind of talked about this already. These invasive species are going to outcompete our natives for space, for light, for all the things that they need, and they're going to lower the overall plant and animal diversity throughout the ecosystem. And many times, these non-native species really provide very little wildlife value. So that's how they kind of impact our wildlife species. Our native wildlife or native fauna has not evolved with these plants to use them. So a lot of times out of the plant's defenses, our native insects can overcome to feed on them. A lot of times, it's just not the ideal food for them. Like the case of these honeysuckle berries, just not the ideal food for a lot of native birds. So in your garden, why do these invasives matter? I mean, they even matter in just our backyard or our landscaping or our garden, because you can be that infection source. You can be essentially that edge habitat to the park right behind you, and you can be the infection source that puts invasives all over that natural area that's close to you. Also, I want to make the point that roads, ditches, waterways, all these potential paths of spread that seeds like to travel through, or wildlife does in spreading the seeds, you can be the infection source for some of those. And lastly, we'll talk about this as we get to some of the individual slides on individual species, but many of these invasives have originated as landscape plants. So before we understood their invasive potential, we planted them in our yards. And so that has then led to infection of natural areas. So it's important to start to pay attention to these and understand that maybe some of the plants that are already planted in our landscape are invasives, and we need to think about some alternatives for those before they do infect natural areas around us. So I always like to talk about this aha moment a lot of people have with invasives. So, and this is that moment at which you realize this plant that's being described to me as an invasive is one that I see in my neighborhood, all over the place, in my yard. That's the plant I can't control in my garden. That's the plant I can't control on my forest edge. And I think we've all had these experiences if you've started to pay attention to invasives. I know one of the big ones for me, well, I'll talk about that when we get to this particular species, but I want to reinforce the fact that although it can be depressing to start to see these invasives all around you, knowledge is empowerment. And the great conservationist Aldo Leopold has kind of I don't know that it's that comforting of a statement, but it kind of sums it up for me that, we live alone in a world of wounds. If you have this ecological education and you understand these invasives, where a lot of the folks out there that don't understand this or haven't had this aha moment go through life not even knowing that that specimen shrub in their front yard is maybe a bush honeysuckle, an invasive species that just grew there for free, and they've manicured as a landscape plant, but maybe is doing some damage to natural areas or is something that we actually don't want to promote in our yard. So hopefully you folks can go home a little empowered after today's presentation. So now let's get into some slides that are specific to different invasive species. So I'm going to start out with a few herbaceous plants, and then we'll move into some woody species, where, as you might imagine, in our forested ecosystems, woody plants are probably some of the bigger competitors. But this first plant, Japanese stiltgrass, was one of those that was an aha moment for me personally. And I think this goes all the way back to about 2009. Our very own Chris Evans planned a stiltgrass summit at SIU, and that was the same year I bought a property out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Shawnee National Forest. And I was sitting there at SIU listening to these presenters talk about this plant, and it just clicked for me. That plant is all over my yard. That's all over the ditches around my house. That is all over the entire stream drainage system that I live in. And it's going to be there for good because it's just such an extensive infestation. So anyway, the thing with stiltgrass to understand is that it is actually an annual grass. So that means that it reproduces each year from seed. So that carpet that you see in the bottom right-hand picture there has all reproduced from seed. So one of the keys to controlling this plant is to not ever let it go to seed. So it'll go to seed late in the season. So that's in August, September, that time frame. It starts to go to seed. So if you can stop it from producing seed, you can stop all those plants from coming up the next year. Now, the thing to know about that is that seed bank is very long-lived many times. So although you've stopped seed production for this year, that doesn't mean there isn't some seed sitting in the seed bank that's going to come up next year. So it does require control for a number of years in a row to stop the spread of this plant or to control it on your property. And the good thing about stiltgrass, at least to me, is that it's a pretty wimpy plant. You know, a foliar spray of glyphosate or maybe a grass-specific herbicide can really knock it back hard, and that can stop seed production. Now, I'll be the first to say that I'm a very organic person in most all of my gardening practices and everything that I do on my property, but invasive species are certainly a point where I kind of draw a line, and that's where I think wise use of chemicals is almost just absolutely required for some of these species. Now, in the case of stiltgrass, it would be possible to hand pull that long enough to exhaust the seed bank and control it, and more or less eradicate it if you could stop the incoming seed from other places. So it is possible to hand pull it. It's possible, you know, an inorganic or an organic way to make it not produce seed is to either mow it or string trim it off so it can't actually produce seed. And that's what I started to do around my yard and some of the places around our house. But believe it or not, I actually had parts of the turf grass in my yard were stilt grass when I bought the place. And you know, they would just grow from seed every year and would just be a little tiny plants mixed into the turf grass. And it just was shocking to me it could be that competitive. But in this next slide here, let's look at a little bit of the identification of this plant. And so in winter, it's very identifiable by its clumps of this straw-looking material. And if you start to observe it around in places where it's at, I think in wintertime, you'll be able to pick it out pretty easily because everything else is dead and you see this nice straw-colored or light brown-colored plant. Probably in the summertime or this time of year when it's come up and leafed out, that silver midrib on the leaf is really one of the main identification features I would look for on it as far as the foliage goes. But if you see the middle picture there, it is, again, a really wimpy plant, and it's really just easy to grab a handful of it and pull it out of the ground. So honestly, in the end, that was one of my major identification keys as I was trying to sort through, is this plant stilt grass or is it something else that's native, especially where it's not, you know, in a lot of places, it will be really dense. And that's how you can kind of tell, okay, this is stilt grass. It's really dense. That's the only plant I see here. But in other places where it's not as dense or there's other plants mixed in, I would just reach down and grab a handful. And if you could pull it up with very little effort, that was a pretty good indication that was stilt grass. Then I'd, of course, confirm with the silver midrib of the leaf. Whereas a lot of the lookalike plants, at least in Southern Illinois, are more perennial and have a better root system and are harder to pull out. They take some effort. So, so those are some of the keys I found of just looking at trying to identify stilt grass. And so today, as I do talk about some of these identification features, I'm going to stay pretty basic like this. I think to me, in the end, I don't think we really need to get into a lot of detailed botanical terms to understand some of these just really general characteristics you can look for that kind of help with identification. And so the next plant that I want to talk about is another herbaceous plant, but it's actually a biennial, and that's garlic mustard. And I think a lot of us that have done any work in natural areas have experienced this plant. It is really statewide at this point. I don't know that there's a county that doesn't have it. And I would guess if there's not a dot on the map, it's maybe just not reported. But it's and this is definitely a plant that if you pay attention to the phenology of it, so the changes throughout the season, right now is a time of year that it is really easy to identify those second-year plants you see in the upper picture there. They've got a four-petaled little white flower, and I don't really think there's many other four-petaled white flowers this time of year. The leaves on that second-year plant are distinctive in the way they have their points, kind of a pointy tip, and the margins have, you know, some kind of irregular points that I think are pretty distinctive. Lastly, you could crush that leaf up and smell a garlic aroma. So, so that's one of the, you know, just the final tests I would do if I thought I had a garlic mustard sample in front of me. But if you look at the bottom picture, the first year plant, or that rosette stage of the plant, does look a little different. Those leaves aren't quite as pointy. So it does get into a little bit of, you really have to think about the fact that this is a biennial plant in your control methods. So hand pulling is a really effective way to control this. And that's a very organic method. That's how I've controlled this plant on my property for many, many years. And another thing is that right now, especially in central Illinois, these plants just stick out like a sore thumb. They're very easy to pull up, especially if the soil has a little bit of moisture, and my kids just love it. So it is a great, kids can easily see this plant. It's about knee high on an adult, so just right in their viewing spot, and they can easily pull it out, and it's just a blast for them to do. One thing with hand pulling though, this plant is actually just tough enough. It's not quite the wimpy plant that I described stiltgrass as. It is so tough that if you pull out a plant that's in flower, it can still actually produce viable seeds. So you don't want to pull those out and just leave them on the ground. You actually need to remove those from the natural area or your property. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to get a hot enough composting system that it would kill the seeds. Burning the plants is not a great idea, because if there are seed pods on there, they can pop and fly out of the spot you're burning it. So you've actually spread some seed there. So really, I mean, I hate to say it, but probably the best way to dispose of these is just like you would your trash, to bag it and unfortunately send it to a landfill. But if you want to think about it this way, those garlic mustard plants that are going to the landfill are not putting thousands and thousands of seeds out per plant like they can do in the natural area or your backyard or whatever place you're pulling those from. So chemical control is also possible. And, one of the biggest goals of our control is to never let this plant go to seed, because again, after 2 years, it bolts, goes to seed, and then dies. So if there's no seed present at that point, there's not going to be a future crop of garlic mustard. So it's really important to stop seed production, and by whatever means possible. And for me, that's hand pulling. You could mow it, you could cut it down one way or another. You'd want to do that well before it starts to flower, if that was one of your control methods. But also glyphosate works pretty well. At that bolting stage, at the rosette stage, there's a couple different chemicals that are recommended, but it is sometimes pretty easy to see it in the springtime, because it does start to grow before many of our natives. And that's going to be kind of a theme as we talk about a lot of these invasives today, that they have definitely different phenology, or different times of the year that you can identify them based on what time of year it is, and knowing those plant processes for that time of the year. So this is the first of the woody plants we'll talk about. We have a couple different vines I'll cover here. So this is Japanese honeysuckle, and just a little vine in the understory, sometimes almost seems harmless. And it's currently it's all over Southern Illinois, and it's kind of scattered in other parts of the state. I would guess it's probably in just about every other part of the state, and maybe is a little bit underreported in my experience. But safe to say, in Southern Illinois, if you walk into a woodland, you're probably going to find this someplace in that woodland. So how does it spread? Mostly by runners, but also by fruits. There's little tiny fruits. I don't really have a picture of those on here, but those flowers you see in the upper right, those would turn to little blackberries. Birds love to eat them. A lot of animals like to eat them, and that's how it kind of gets spread around and starts new infections. But it's really the spread of the stems in a particular forest stand that starts to really engulf things, like you see in this picture of some edge habitat here. So it's pretty common to see in those edge habitats where there's a little more sunlight, or any place there's an opening in the forest, that this plant really starts to grow up and strangle things. And all of that green foliage you see, this is just a closer up picture of that edge habitat we looked at a little bit earlier. All that green stuff you see is Japanese honeysuckle right there. And those are actually little oak seedlings that it's starting to strangle and grow over. And over time, it can actually shade out that oak canopy by growing up the stem and out-competing it. So it can be, with enough light, a super competitive plant. And then, like I mentioned before, further back into the stand, there wasn't that much of it. So, in spots where it's more shady, it thins out a little bit. But the nice thing about this plant is that, like we've talked about with phenology, this plant stays green a little later into the season. And in Southern Illinois, where there's a little milder of a climate, it stays green almost the entire winter long in a lot of places. So what we can do is time our treatment of this plant for when our native plants went to sleep for the year. Once they're dormant, this plant keeps growing. And so the ideal setting is kind of in the fall on a warmer day, because we're going to have to use a chemical on this plant to really get effective control on a larger scale. On a warmer day, when those plants are photosynthesizing well, so probably over 45 degrees in temperature, a foliar application of glyphosate is something that really works great to control this plant. Now, I did put in one of the bullets at the bottom of this slide, a combination of burning and spraying are best, and that is certainly true for this plant. a good burn. Now, as anybody that's prescribed burn knows that we get sometimes not perfect coverage from a prescribed burn, but a good effective burn can control a good percentage of this plant in a forested stand. However, research has shown that in the next couple years, that population can rebound and almost surpass its pre-burn numbers. So we do have to follow up any type of burning with a herbicide to effectively control this. Now, in areas where you can get in and mow or string trim or do some type of mechanical control like that, I have actually mowed this out of places where I was doing some mowing. So it is possible to do that, but in a forested setting where we really want native species to grow back into that place, we don't want to mow or string trim, so we're going to have to probably control it one way or another. And it really is a matter of launching into a total control plan with this plant. And the best thing, again, is a combination of spraying and burning, where burning would be done on a not an annual basis, but on a regular basis to control it, to keep it out of the stand. And herbicide would be what we would have used to kind of almost eradicate it, and then burning could maintain that over time. The next one I want to cover is Oriental Bittersweet. And so we're going to cover one more vine after this, and they're kind of in increasing order of seriousness. So not that Japanese honeysuckle is anything to take for granted, but Oriental Bittersweet is a woody vine, obviously from Asia, that has the capability of growing into the canopy and really starting to dominate a stand of trees. So in some cases, even pulling down canopies of mature trees. So it can really do a lot of damage once it gets established. So where does it like to be? In a little more open woodlands. So it would like a little more sun, kind of like Japanese honeysuckle. If it gets a little bit of light, it's really going to go crazy. On the edges of those woodlands, in disturbed areas, those are some of the places where Oriental Bittersweet's really going to like it. But unfortunately, it grows competitively really in just about all those places. So with control, it kind of depends with this plant. If it's a large, established, mature population of this plant, you're going to need to do a cut stump treatment. So that's where we cut the plant off and treat that stump with a herbicide, or a basal bark application of an appropriate herbicide. So that's where we would actually spray a herbicide on the bark that soaks in, so to speak, and kills the plant systemically, so it goes into the root system. However, the thing to know about bittersweet is that it is really difficult to get that herbicide, by whatever means you apply it, to translocate all the way down to the roots and totally kill the plant. So no matter what method you use to attack it initially, that's going to take some follow-up. Foliar spray is possible on smaller plants, on plants that are, especially when something gets over our head, that's really an unsafe point to spray a foliar spray into the air. So smaller plants, after you've done some of your initial control, a foliar spray may be possible as just kind of spot treatments or to keep things in check, or for some of your follow-up treatments. So as far as what's the main identification feature on this plant, for me, it's always been that leaf that's wider at the tip. So if you see, there's a really good example on that picture right in the center of a leaf that's wider at the tip. And so one question with this plant I get a lot, though, is what is the difference between Oriental Bittersweet and our native bittersweet? And at least for me, and I know there's other details with botanical terms and all those kind of things that we could talk about, but for me, the biggest difference has been with Oriental Bittersweet, we have fruits at the leaf axils. And with American Bittersweet, we have fruit at the tips of the plant. So that requires kind of looking at the plant as a whole and not just one spot, and trying to pick out areas where you can find those features and identify them. But I think honestly for me, with our native American Bittersweet, you're really not going to ever see it taking over a stand like Oriental Bittersweet does. So a lot of times when a landowner had what they thought could be Oriental Bittersweet, and it was, big and burly enough they'd noticed it, that's probably what it was, because our native species would not be invasive like that. That's just not how it functions in its native ecosystem. So the next plant, this is probably the biggest and baddest and worst of all the invasive vines we can have in the U.S. And kudzu is the name of it, and it has just a wide-ranging amount of habitats that it would infest. Now, Thankfully, it's really mostly confined to the southern part of our state and maybe a little bit in northeastern Illinois, but it's not all over like you might see in the South. And that's where, that was one of those aha moments for me years ago, was going to the Smoky Mountains and seeing, you know, pictures like you see in the bottom right there, where all of those towers of green vegetation, that's kudzu vine covering what used to be trees. So it just is incredibly aggressive in its growth, and really, really difficult to control once it's established. So when we do need to control an established stand, or any stand, we do need to use a specific herbicide that you know, is specific to the bean or aster families, is what that herbicide controls that's listed there. And so it's nice that it's specific to kudzu and it doesn't attack some of our native plants that are around it. So unfortunately, it's a very expensive control. It does need to be done correctly. So if you do have kudzu on your property or you're attempting control, definitely talk with someone that's done it before, because there's a lot of details in this control, and it's really a serious plant to deal with. The one kudzu infestation that just sticks out in my mind from Southern Illinois that just was another one of those aha moments at really how fast it can invade and take over, was on it was a CRP site that was a hilltop in a forested setting. So it was basically a ridge top that had been cleared for farming, probably wasn't the best place to farm, and went back to CRP. And so I knew that that field had been farmed fairly recently and had been controlled and was recently put into CRP. And you could actually see in some of the area, there was a little bit of it that was still farmed. And you could see in that area where corn had been planted, this was in August that I was on the site, kudzu had grown in, I think I counted 22 rows of the corn it had grown into. And so if you can picture that amount of distance of rows of corn, that plant had grown that far in just one season, because we know the farmer had to have tilled it up and, you know, removed all those stems the year before. And so that just kind of illustrates how fast it can grow and overtake things. So probably our most serious woody vine to deal with in Illinois if you have it, and definitely need to probably have some professional help if you're looking to control that plant. Multiflora Rose will be the first kind of woody shrubby plant we talk about today, and it's boy, it's one of those that is just statewide, probably in every county, and a lot of us have probably experienced this guy walking around the woods, because its prickly thorns are pretty offensive a lot of times. And so the main ID feature for me anyway on this plant is just simply that it looks like a rose. It has that you know, rose looking thorn on the stem, a green stem, and it has white flowers in the springtime. So some of our native roses, they don't have white flowers, they have other colors. So another way to differentiate between Multiflora Rose and our natives is that its stipules, the base of the leaf there, have teeth. So you can see a pretty good picture of that there. So those are probably a couple of ID features. You know, how does it spread? From seeds and stem sprouts? It spreads and forms just impenetrable thickets is probably the problem. You know, areas where it's going to totally outcompete and shade out native plants. But I think the reason most folks or landowners have kind of complained about this plant, to me anyway, is because it is prickly and offensive, and you know, we want it out of those areas, so it's not you know, limiting our access. So the good news about it is that it is very thin barked, easily killed by fire or a torch. If you guys have ever done weed control that way with a torch, you can flame it at the base. But the best control method for this and a lot of these woody plants we're going to talk about is a cut stump treatment. That's where we cut it off again and treat that stump. Repeated cutting or mowing can be effective. And I've done that for some areas of forest edge where it was bad, where I've actually repeatedly used you know, a string trimmer with one of the big saw blades that spins on it. So that's a great way to chop it down and just repeatedly cut it out of that area. So there are some ways to control this one, maybe without too much chemical use. Our next plant is Russian olive, and this is one that, you know, Russian olive, autumn olive, there's two different species here. So I've, you know, kind of summarized those as species here in the slide, but they occur throughout the state. And the thing with autumn olive that's maybe the saving grace here is that it requires a little more light. It's not going to be in the forest interior. So that makes it maybe a little less of a challenge for some of our native trees. So we're usually going to see it in the forest edge. It's one of those species that's going to be really important to control in the forest edge. Again, cut stump treatment is going to be the most effective, and the optimal timing for that, and really for many of these woody plants, is in fall time, because the process in that plant in fall is that it's about to senesce. It's taking all the energy out of its leaves down into its root system. So if we cut off the stump and treat that with a herbicide, it's going to take the herbicide right with it down into the roots and kill the plant, hopefully. So it's also really shallow rooted. So it is possible to pull out a lot of these plants, or even to pull out large plants with some kind of piece of equipment. Now, we're probably always going to need some type of follow-up chemical treatment to keep those from coming back, because those berries are, lots of birds eat them and lots of birds spread them. So to look at ID real quick, for me, one of the main identification features, if you can see berries, are those sparkly berries. They have little sparkly glints in them. You can kind of see in that picture, but the silver underside of the leaf is really a major identification feature. And if you look at this in the field in bright sunlight, that's usually really easy to see. In the wintertime, it has a lot of lenticels on its bark, on its twigs. I mean, you can see those in the summertime as well, but in the wintertime, in the absence of leaves, that's a great key that it's autumn olive. The next plant we'll talk about is bush honeysuckle, and this refers to a number of different Asian honeysuckle species that are shrubs that we've brought here that are invading a lot of our forests. And really the big issue with this plant is that it's totally shade tolerant. It can take over that super shady understory and just shade out anything else, where none of our native trees can get going down there. So it really inhabits, it's statewide. You see it all over the place. You see it in urban landscapes and forested settings and natural areas. It's just absolutely all over. It would, I think you heard Chris Evans say earlier this week, probably the biggest threat to Illinois forests is this plant from an invasive species. And I would totally agree. In my experience, it takes over an entire understory, and there's so many stands of trees I went into that are just a monotype of honeysuckle in the understory. So again, the most effective treatment on this is a cut stump, and fall time is one of the best. But this is definitely one that's really shallow rooted, and especially when the soil's kind of moist, you can pull it. Another thing my kids love to do is pull this in the early spring, because it leaves out early, and we can see that before a lot of the other stuff leaves out. It's one of the only green things. That's maybe one of the depressing facts of starting to learn the idea of this plant is, in the early springtime and the late fall, because it also keeps its leaves a little later into the fall, it just sticks out like a sore thumb in a forested stand. So anyway, that's one of the keys, though, to controlling it, is using that to our advantage. So in the fall time, if we're going to do some foliar spraying, we can safely apply chemicals, again, after all of our natives are dormant and when this plant's still growing. So that's a possibility. But one nice thing about the fact that it is shallow rooted is that with a little initial chemical control to kind of knock back our population, it's pretty easily managed down the road by, on an annual basis, hand pulling those plants, the smaller ones that come in from seed. So it can be brought down with an initial chemical control. It can be controlled organically then in the future. So what's the key identification features for this plant? Obviously, the berries in the top right-hand corner, later in the season, we'll see those. But for me, this distinctive arching branch habit, that's one of the things that I would look for this plant. Wintertime, summertime, whenever it was, I stopped really even looking at foliage or anything. That was how I could sometimes tell this plant from a distance. But also, when you combine that distinctive branching habit with the very clearly opposite twigs and leaves, they're super duper opposite. They, to me, are like kind of the example of an opposite branching system. So those are some of the ID features of that. So the next woody shrub we'll cover is barberry. And this is one that definitely came from the landscape industry. So a lot of us probably have these possibly growing in our yards. But it's one that I had to kind of see in the wild before I understood its invasive nature, but it certainly can take over the understory and dominate like many of these other shrubs. It's scattered throughout the state is its current range, so it's not everywhere. It's not in every single spot like bush honeysuckle, but definitely spreads by its berries. So you see in the upper right-hand picture there, like a stem with some of the red berries on it. And I think the biggest identification is just it has smaller leaves. It does have thorns. The picture there does not show the thorns too well, but smaller leaves, thorns, and those red berries would tell me that it's barberry. You know, it's similar to Multiflora Rose in that it has really thin bark. It's pretty effectively controlled with a torch or burning, and maybe some follow-up with the spray to make sure it doesn't come back. But so there's maybe some organic control methods here that we could use as far as, you know, either prescribed burning or burning it specifically with a torch for smaller infestations, or if we needed to, of course, in a larger infestation, a cut stump method is probably always going to be our most effective treatment on a woody plant like this. Our next plant is burning bush, which is again another one from the ornamental plant trade, and really easily identified by its winged stems. And you can see a good picture of that right there. It has very opposite branching pattern, but different than some of the other plants that might look the same, like honeysuckle. It has a toothed edge on its leaf. So if I see a wing stem, is going to really tell me it's or burning bush first off, but you know, those toothed leaves also in the opposite arrangement help. Cut stump treatment is going to be the most effective on it. And that's going to, you know, again, best timed in the late fall, but any time of year that you really, you know, once the growing season gets going, once summer gets going and it has leaves on it, any time of year you want to treat this with a cut stump would be effective. And its main spread mechanism are berries that birds eat and spread around. So definitely one of those plants you can find in a landscape center and plant in your yard, but we probably should reconsider that one. Next is Tree of Heaven, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday in Kelly's talk in the fact that it's a preferred host of the spotted lanternfly. So it's one that we probably need to pay a little more attention to. And this is one that maybe breaks some of the rules of always, you know, of a cut stump treatment always being the most effective. In this case, if we cut this stem off at the ground, it's going to spur a lot of shoots from the roots. So that root system is going to send up all kinds of shoots. So if you cut the stem off, you can actually make your problem a lot worse in a forested setting. Now, if it was in your yard or it was a single specimen tree, maybe that would work. But the recommended treatment is a basal bark treatment, and some of that, the reason being, it has really thin bark, so it's easy to treat that way. So this is one of those plants that we see statewide. It grows in the cracks of sidewalks. It's that just tough. But in a forested setting, it doesn't always have a great advantage unless there's a little more light. So in a really shaded, mature overstory, it has a little bit of a hard time getting going. But in areas where there's a little bit more light is where it's going to kind of thrive and dominate. So as far as identification goes, one of the main ones for me is if it has seeds on it, that samara, that's similar to maybe some of our native ashes, probably looks a little bit like an ash with its compound leaf. Has its seed right in the center where an ash would have it at the tip, or at the attachment point is probably where an ash's seed is. The center rachis is red on those compound leaves, which you can't always see, but later in the season, especially that rachis is red. So that kind of always eliminates some of the other possibilities or lookalikes would be our ashes and walnuts. So the heart-shaped leaf scar is one that I think is pretty characteristic, but looks a little similar to walnut. So the one difference with black walnut is it has a very similar looking leaf scar to that, but it has a chambered pith. So that's how you can kind of eliminate walnut pretty easily, is by cutting into that pith and finding the chambered pith. And our last tree species we'll talk about today is Callery pear or Bradford pear. And, you know, it's really mostly confined to edge habitat, to more open places. It's really more of a threat to probably a prairie restoration than a forested setting. But I always like to mention it because it's another one of those landscape trees that has become invasive. So what's the best way to treat it? Cut stump treatment, just like a lot of these other woody species. So we'd want to cut it off and treat that stump pretty quickly after making the cut. What's the best identification feature of this plant? For me, in the summertime, it's these glossy dark green leaves. They look very waxy or dark green, and I can almost pick out that color from a distance compared to other trees. A little bit earlier in spring, the picture in the bottom right shows it in flower, and it's one of the few things that flowers that early in the season with white flowers. So that's kind of a phenology tip we can apply to this one, and is that in the early spring, it's like one of the few things with just white flowers that really sticks out. So now let's end with just a discussion of a few great resources, and here's 3 of them on this page that we're going to that I'll talk about briefly, and some of these have been mentioned earlier this week, but EDD Maps is a great place to go for not only at the top, you can see up there by home, there's distribution maps is something that I use it for a ton, but it has individual species information. It also has a reporting system. So this is, if you guys find a new invasive in your area, this is probably the place I would go to report that, because I think their maps are the most accurate, and they're probably a great place to contribute additional data to. Here's an example of one of their maps. And what I like about this, like with Tree of Heaven, you can see the coverage around the US, and it helps me kind of understand in the context of Illinois how this plant might move or perform. This is the county view of the maps. You can actually view the individual reports of where it was and how it was reported, and there's just a ton of information on this website. As far as identification goes, this is one of my favorite all-time guides put out by the River to River Cooperative Weed Management in Southern Illinois, and in print it's a little pocket guide, but great for just identification. It doesn't necessarily go into control details, but you can see the list of plants there, and it's free online as a download. And if you just, Google invasive plants of Southern Illinois, you can get to that. Another favorite location, and this is one of the places I go for those really specific herbicide recommendations, is that the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission has what they call these management guidelines, is the tab that you need to click on in the bottom left to get to a whole list of these for just about all the invasives that occur in Illinois. Here's an example of the one for the bush honeysuckles. And one thing I really like about their management guidelines is that in the top right there, you can see that was updated in 2017. I love the fact that they're regularly updating these guidelines. And so you can see it about how current the data would be in there, but it has wonderful details for identification and all the features of the plant and the botany associated with that plant. But also it has control recommendations for not only highly disturbed or impacted sites, but for super sensitive sites, where on a sensitive site, we worry about a lot of the non-target plant impacts. So they kind of give you two different levels of control you can look at, and they do a pretty good job of discussing like failed control and things you really don't want to do, and some of the mishaps folks have had over the years. So a really good set of guides there, available free on the internet. And finally, this is probably the most Illinois specific, just all in one place guide for control I've seen, one of the best for control. And in print, it's again a little book that you can take with you in the field. So highly recommend this. It's again a free download on the internet, and just has just about every invasive species you can think of in Illinois, separated by the type of plant that it is. And it does again provide specific, herbicide control recommendations and how to do it and where and when and all the details. And so with that, let's go to any questions folks might have. I think I've seen some activity rolling into the chat box there. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind queuing up a few of the questions.
Of course. Thanks, Ryan. Wonderful presentation. We have had a lot of questions coming in already. I'm going to go back to when you were talking about forest. We had some questions about that. And the first one was, what would signs of grazing in the forest look like?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess what signs of grazing would look like a lot of times, more recent grazing is damage to the base of the trunk of large trees. And I mean, you could see that. I mean, even, not necessarily even more recently, but long term, you would see rotten spots in the base of trees, just damaged bottoms of trees, old fence posts and old fence in tree trunks. Boy, that's a good sign that was grazed at some point. And then also species composition. So grazing is going to select for, one of the main species it selects for, if it's present, is honey locust, because all of our grazing animals don't like that thorny plant, and it's just not an attractive grazing material for them. So we can also see that in a degraded stand of species that are resistant to grazing. So those are some of the main signs.
Alrighty. Are there any virgin stands of forest left in Illinois?
Oh, that's another good question. For the most part, no. And it's safe to say even some of these, some of the spots that are the most pristine in the Shawnee National Forest were cut over at one time or another. And, I heard about that in college. I went to SIU for my master's degree and undergrad degree. And you'd hear about that all these forests were cut over at one point or another. And, it really didn't ring true to me until I saw a picture from Alto Pass, and that's a small town that's the closest to where my house was in Southern Illinois. And there's a really scenic overlook there that looks to the south and looks over all these forested hills, just beautiful. Bald Knob Cross is there in the scene. And somebody was giving a presentation about the Civilian Conservation Corps, just a wonderful presentation on how that whole project happened during the Depression, and showed a picture from that Alto Pass overlook, and it was barren hills there. So I mean, that really like brought the message home to me. Okay, all these places were cleared at one point for some type of land use. Now, as far as what hasn't been cut, I know that there's probably a few places on the map folks could point you to. I don't know of a specific state or national forest area that isn't, but there's actually some pockets in places I've found where either bluffs have stopped access for one reason or another, where there's tiny pockets of things, but I can't tell you a specific stand or a location that was actually not cut over. I know there's a few that exist, but I'm sorry, I can't actually pinpoint any of those on the map.
Oh yeah, no worries. Let me see here. We had a couple questions about pulling and bagging garlic mustard, and they wanted to know, could you wait, for 6 months or something and throw it away, or could you put it out in the sun to cook for a while? What's the safe way to do that?
Well, the safe way is to just absolutely dispose of it. And I know, I just as much as anybody else, I hate the fact that it would go to a landfill, but I just think that the risk of all those thousands of seeds making it to soil somewhere where they could grow is not worth it. So for me, I've always bagged it and just gotten rid of it. I mean, I think another possibility would maybe be to like bury it. But from what I've read, it's really difficult to compost it hot enough to stop the viability of those seeds. So, I mean, again, if you get into burying it, that's kind of difficult too, because you're going to want to get it deep enough that it can never be turned up. With any excavation, you're going to have to dig a hole, which is labor intensive. So I think really the best recommendation is just to get it out of there and to throw it away, because we certainly don't want it going into any of the yard waste, the stream of yard waste from any municipality, because it'll wind up as viable seeds and mulch or something else possibly down the line.
All right. Are there other native honeysuckles besides Japanese to plant or to use? How do they differ in appearance?
I'm going to have to admit that I don't know the answer to that question. We do have native honeysuckles, but I mean, in my experience, I guess they're so few and far between. I can't say that I've seen them a lot. So yeah, good question, and I'll have to get back to folks on that.
Okay. We're running out of time. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to have to hop around here a little bit. Somebody wanted to know, what do you recommend to use for the cut stump treatments on plants like autumn olive, Russian olive, and bush honeysuckle?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I used to use a variety of different things. I found that really glyphosate at the right formulation. Now you need to always follow the label on this stuff. So that would be, it's really important with glyphosate because there's so many different products out there that have it in it and so many different formulations. So really need to follow the label closely. But I know a lot of folks have complained about its use in cut stump treatments in the past and thought they needed something stronger. But honestly, for me, it's been really effective and at the labeled rate for a stump treatment. Now, there's things that are super effective, like Tordon is a trade name for picloram is the chemical name. That's something I probably wouldn't recommend because it does a really good job of killing the stump when you get it on there, but it also is mobile in the soil and can kill other non-target plants around it. So for me, the thing that I found the most effective, probably the cheapest, the easiest to get, is glyphosate.
Great. Since we're already past 2 o'clock, I'll end with one more question. Somebody wanted to know about winter creeper, and does it hurt trees that it climbs up?
So winter creeper is a species of Euonymus that's a vine that, yeah, definitely will climb up trees. We've probably all seen it in somebody's yard climbing up the trunk of a tree because it's called winter creeper. It stays evergreen. it can hurt a tree in the long run. So I don't really recommend, and I have some friends that have it on a few trees where it's a silver maple that this vine is out competing. So silver maple grows relatively quick. That's actually what we're looking at on the screen here is a dense stand of all silver maple in the river bottoms. It's almost, that winter creeper has almost reached the tips of the branches and at some point shades out enough of the leaf area on that tree canopy that it starts to impact tree health. So it's not something that overnight happens and is a big issue, but in the long run, it can be a lot of weight in the canopy for one thing that can cause limbs to break out. It can be an issue with shading out the actual leaf area of that tree. So I really don't recommend letting it grow up the trunk of a tree, even in an urban setting, but in a forested setting, especially so, it can be an issue in some of those trees if it gets going now. But it does seem like it has to have like a little bit more light than a fully shaded, mature forest stand. So there's a lot of places where it doesn't get as bad as climbing up the trunk. But yeah, that definitely can cause damage either structurally by pulling the tree down or breaking it off in a storm, or by actually shading it out if it gets bad enough.
All right, thank you so much, Ryan. I think we're going to have to leave it here. There's quite a few additional questions that we just don't have time to get to. There was some great conversation in the chat box throughout the presentation as well. So thanks again. We really appreciate your time and effort on this, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us today, and what a great symposium this week. So thanks everyone.
Definitely. Thanks everybody for attending these the different symposium presentations. I hope you enjoyed it, and look for some communication from us next week with resources, handouts, and links to the videos. All right, everybody have a great weekend.